On July 4th, 2021, a group of people from the Triangle region Zoomed to talk about virtual microgrids. It's probably appropriate that we are doing this on July the 4th, which is Independence Day in the US, because I see this as our first small step in gaining energy independence. There's a lot of talk about getting independence in energy consumption and production, and what we're going to talk about is just one step in that path. We have applied to the Shire Council for a little bit of funding to help with this project, but I heard last week that we won't know the outcome of that until October of this year. The money that they've set aside for environmental projects has been confirmed, but exactly which projects get how much they won't be able to announce until they've come up with their council 4-year plan, which will be in October. But I thought that shouldn't hold us back. There's stuff we can do before that, and this is the first stage in the process. What we're going to talk about tonight is firstly, what is a virtual microgrid? We've talked about microgrids in the past, but a virtual microgrid is a slightly different twist to it. What is Power Tracer, which is the tool we'll be using in this process? What are the benefits of a virtual microgrid? What can we do before October when the council makes their funding decision? And what might we do after that when we have more surety about that? In fact, the financial assistance we've asked for from council is really a small part of the application. To me, the major part of that application is getting council backing for projects like this to show that they are committed to moving in this direction. That's really the purpose of applying for the support. Okay, so what is a microgrid? You will have probably heard of this term in various ways, and there are 101 different meanings depending on who you listen to or what you read. At the heart of a microgrid is the sharing of production and consumption. The old days when there was just one big producer of energy and lots of small consumers, clearly in the last 20 years changed, so that we've now still got some large producers of energy, but we've got lots and lots of small producers as well, of which some of you are part of that group. And there are lots of consumers. So if we can look to how we can better share that production and consumption, particularly at a local level, then that's what microgrids try to foster. Another aspect of microgrids is their ability to what we call island from the main grid. As we found out a couple of weeks ago, when that storm went through and there were widespread blackouts, it would have been very useful in some areas if you could have islanded from the main grid. When the grid went out somewhere else because of a fallen tree and you lost your power as well, in some circumstances, the ability to island will keep some areas going and not be affected by more remote events where the power actually goes down. So a microgrid can be quite handy in that situation. Microgrids can also enable the sharing of energy storage systems, batteries and so forth. There are limitations on that, and we'll talk about that a bit later, but it is one of the possibilities with microgrids that as well as sharing power that you produce by solar panels, you can also share energy that you've stored in batteries. There are two types of microgrids, what are called real-time sharing and retrospective sharing. Real-time sharing is where decisions are being made on the fly as to who will share energy with whom and at what price. That requires fairly sophisticated control systems to actually make those decisions in real time. Retrospective sharing is when you do the sharing after the event. So after the electricity has been produced and consumed, you can work out how that could have been matched from a producer to a consumer. And there's also the concept of microgrids that are what are called behind the meter or in front of the meter. And we'll talk about both of those and show what the difference is and what we're going to use in our situation. Let's look at that first up. What we mean by behind the meter is where you've got a group of households or businesses or other properties where only one of them is connected by a meter to the grid. All the others are connected to that single point of connection to the grid and can share energy between themselves. A good example of behind the meter system would be apartments in a body corporate, where the body corporate entity is the only one that's actually connected to the grid, and all the apartments in that building are connected to each other and to that connection point, but not directly to the grid themselves. So in a sense, the body corporate, through that connection point, buys and sells to the grid, and then the apartments, all those other properties, trade within themselves and with the body corporate. In that situation, behind the meter, the islanding is relatively simple because it's just a matter of cutting off the body corporate from the grid. And then by definition, all the rest of the properties are cut off, but they can connect with each other still. And battery sharing is relatively feasible. If the body corporate has a large battery, then in fact the apartments within that body corporate can store their energy in the battery, take energy out of the battery later, without the need for each of them to have their own batteries. And there are actually some economies of scale in having those larger batteries. In front of the meter, on the other hand, is where all the properties are connected directly to the grid, each with their individual meters. And that's the situation we would find ourselves in on a day-to-day basis. We've all got connections to the grid individually. We all have our own meters. We all get our own bills. We buy and we maybe sell to the grid on a one-on-one basis. In that situation, islanding is more complex and battery sharing is less feasible, because if one of the properties has a battery, say a community centre, then if they've got a large solar installation themselves, they can put their own energy into the battery quite easily. But if they then want to sell that battery energy to the rest of the microgrid participants, they will need to transfer that energy through the network, in our case the AusNet network, and they'll have to pay a fee to do that. Even worse, if you want the individual participants to store their energy in the battery and then use it later, for example at night, then in order to store their energy in the battery on another property, they'll have to pay AusNet to move the energy to the battery. And then at night, when they want to use the energy, they'll have to pay to get it back again. So you're actually paying the network charge twice in that situation. So it's economically much less feasible unless there are special rates for those transfers. It is, however, possible to convert an in front of the meter system to a behind the meter system under certain circumstances. And that all really depends on the topography, the layout of the network that's connecting all those properties. For some time I've been looking for the map I'm about to show, and I just happened to stumble across it today. This is the AusNet network supplying our region. The red line up in the top left of the diagram is the high voltage power lines that run through Tagati. And the darker lines, the purple lines, are all the low voltage lines, the distribution system. So the red line is your transmission system, and the purple lines are your distribution system, which takes the power to the individual households. One of the things you notice with this is that it's an end of the line situation. Narberthong is at the bottom left, and it stops there. Marysville is middle bottom. Buxton's in the middle of the page. Tagati's up the top. And there's a single line, or after Buxton are split into two lines, but a single line that carries it back to the main grid up north of Alexandra, which is beyond our diagram here. So that end of line situation gives some possibilities in the future to actually look at converting what is essentially an in front of the meter system at the moment to behind the meter. For example, if you were able to install a switch, so to speak, on that line going to Marysville, so that you could cut that part of the network off from the rest of the grid, then all the households south of that line on the Marysville line would still be connected to each other by the grid poles and wires, but would be disconnected from the rest of the grid. So if there was, for example, a blackout in, let's say, Tagati, which brought down that entire system, then having an islanding switch in that location would enable Marysville to disconnect from the grid. And the important thing about that is not so much the ability to share between each other then, it's the ability to even stay turned on at all. Because the problem during a blackout is that even solar systems can't work because you can't allow the possibility that power will get into the network, the grid network, while people are working on it, trying to restore power. So here, if the Marysville area was cut off, you could still be sharing power internally without having any of that power going out into the rest of the grid where it's trying to be restored. Similarly, you could cut off the Narberthon line with a switch, and then that area could operate independently. It becomes behind the meter. All the households south of that red line are still connected. They could still be generating power and using power without affecting the rest of the grid. On the other hand, if Buxton wanted to be in that situation, you'd have to do the switch north of Buxton, which would then enable it to be isolated, islanded, but along with Marysville and Narberthon. So because of the topography of the network there, all three towns would go into an islanding situation. And if you wanted to include Taggart, you just keep moving the cutoff point further and further north. Now, whilst that does increase your scope or the size of an islanded area that way, it also increases the risk. As I mentioned before, if the blackout was caused because of a tree down in Taggart, then if this was your islanding system, a tree coming down in Taggart would immobilise Marysville, Narberthon, Buxton as well, if they were in the same island. So it may be worthwhile in that situation having cut-off points, a number of cut-off points differently spaced around the network. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's what we're going to do now. All I'm saying is that this is a possibility, and the possibility comes about because of the possibility of leasing a part of the network from AusNet for islanding purposes. And Pete will talk about this a little bit later with someone he's aware of that's doing a very similar thing. What we're going to look at with our proposed virtual microgrid, I'll use the terminology VMG for short in later slides, virtual microgrid. It'll be about sharing power production and consumption. It'll be using retrospective sharing, not real-time sharing, and I'll explain how in a minute. And it'll be in front of the meter because we'll all be individual households. We won't be behind a single meter. But what we just showed with the network there is a possibility down the track. So as I said before, this is just the first small step in gaining energy independence. Getting those islanded areas may be another step. In trying to explain some of this as we go along, I'm going to use a bathtub analogy. What I mean by that is if you think of the network, say the AusNet network of poles and wires as being a giant bathtub, which stores energy. And we'll talk about this long-term and short-term storage in a minute. But the analogy is that grid generation, the coal-fired power stations around the state, around the country, are putting electricity into that network, and that energy is appropriately coloured brown. Whereas local generation through solar panels is also putting energy into that network, and obviously that's green energy. And what comes out in that situation with consumption to all the households, properties, businesses, etc., is neither totally green or totally brown. It's some other colour. It's a mixture of local energy, green energy, renewable energy, non-renewable energy, distant source energy. So what you're getting out is after you've sort of stirred the tub a little bit. The idea of islanding is to put a baffle in the bathtub so the water on the left-hand side can't mix with the water on the right-hand side, or the electricity on the left doesn't mix with the electricity on the right because you cut it off. And in that situation, the local consumption is coming from just the local generation once you're islanded. If you haven't flicked the switch and you're not islanded, then you'd be back in the original situation where you're taking a mixture of the bath water, a mixture of electricity. Some renewable, some not. Some local, some non-local. But if you island, then you're both limited, but also you know what you're getting in terms of the electricity and where it's come from. Now, there's some other types of arrangement that can be thought of in terms of this bathtub. Some of you might have heard of what's called a power purchase agreement, a PPA, where a group of consumers agree to buy energy, purchase power from a particular producer. And this often happens with respect to large solar or wind farms, or sometimes bioenergy plants. So they put their energy into the network. So for example, all the large solar plants out in Western Victoria, their power goes into the network, and they come to an agreement, a contract, that certain consumers will preferentially buy their energy. So for example, just recently, a large number of municipal councils have agreed to buy all their energy from a large solar plant in Western Victoria. So the solar plant is putting their energy into the bathtub, and by contract, the councils are buying their energy. In reality, the normal grid generation, the solar farm input, and the local generation all go into the same big bathtub. And it's only by a contractual agreement that the PPA participants, the local councils, a business, a community, it's only by agreement that they buy their power from the large solar farm out somewhere in the States. And that's a very recognised form of power purchase. And I introduce that because what we're talking about with a virtual microgrid of the type we're going to be looking at, what it's really like is many micro PPAs. That is, instead of a group of consumers agreeing to buy from one large producer, what this is the microgrid participants agree to buy and sell to and from many other households. Each one is a producer, each one is a consumer. But like the PPA agreement, all this is really doing is just having a lot of micro PPAs running in parallel to each other. So the model is already there. We just have to think about it in a slightly different format. So that's the sort of system we're talking about, where the microgrid participants both supply energy to the system. It all goes into the big bathtub, but when they buy that energy, they're effectively buying it back from other microgrid participants, just like the councils are buying it from one large solar farm. Okay, well, how are we going to do that? In the handout that I sent out to you about tonight's meeting, I mentioned a system called Power Tracer, which has been developed by a company called Enosi Australia. And what Power Tracer is software developed by Enosi, and it's used by several retailers around Australia already, that uses retrospective data. We used that word before. And what it does is a matching of electricity sales and purchases of participants as recorded by their smart meters. Victoria in particular, but most of Australia, is very blessed by the fact that smart meters have been installed in all houses, in all properties. Because that enables schemes like this to actually get up and running, to enable the sharing and a whole range of other things. So there's four major key topics here about this Power Tracer. It's retrospective data, and I'll explain that in a minute. And what it does is match sales and purchases from the data from smart meters. So what is that retrospective data that it's using? It's obtained from yesterday's readings on your smart meter. So as you go through the day, your smart meter is recording every 30 minutes how much power you're buying from the grid and how much you're selling to the grid. So what Power Tracer does is to collect those NMI readings, the National Meter Identifier readings, from each participant on a daily basis, and matches for yesterday who was selling to the grid in our group, who was buying, how can they be matched up to get a transaction from someone who wanted to sell in that 30 minutes to someone who wanted to buy in that 30 minutes. And it's important that it's in that 30 minutes. Energy cannot be stored and sold later to someone who wanted to buy it, because in reality, 30 minutes is already a gross overestimation of how long the energy is in the system. The energy is in the system virtually instantaneously. It's in, it's out. They allow 30 minutes grace for this matching. This NMI data from your smart meter is readily obtainable from your distributor, in our case AusNet, or from your retailer. Some have things on their online sites which allow you to download that data yourself. I know, for example, we're with Indigo Power and we do that. We were with PowerShop, we did it with them as well. And other retailers have the same facility. As I mentioned, the smart meter data records the electricity bought from the grid and sold to the grid in those 30-minute periods. That's the critical thing about it. Importantly, they just measure purchases and sales with the grid. They don't record how much electricity has been produced by your solar panels. They don't record how much you've put into and taken out of batteries. And they don't record how much you've used in your household. They simply record the sales and purchases. So if you think about it from the other side of the coin, if you were the distributor or the retailer, that's what you want to know. How much was bought and sold to me, the distributor or the retailer? From our side of the coin, the household, we've got a number of other things going on as well, not just sales and purchases with the grid. When you download your NMI data from AusNet, that little distinction is important to realise. Don't believe the labels that are in the data that you get. They use the title consumption for a whole bunch of their statistics. It's not consumption, it's not how much energy you use at all, it's how much you bought from the grid. Similarly, they use the word generation. It's not how much you produced or how much you generated, it's how much you sold to the grid, because you may well have used a lot of that generation yourself. I think it's a hangover from when it's a pre-solar terminology. Pre-solar, when no one was producing their own energy, what you brought from the grid is what you used. That's what you consumed. That's the only thing you could buy. Generation, well, it didn't even exist back then because you couldn't generate and you couldn't sell to the grid anyway. Just remember, it's only sales and purchases with the grid. As I say, it is readily obtainable online, and you can get it either from your retailer, whoever that is, or for everyone in our area, no matter who their retailer is, you can get it from AusNet, the distributor. And they have a website called My Home Energy. So what you do to get your smart data is to first register with My Home Energy. Then you go online and you select your NMI from the list. You might have more than one, but most of you will only have one meter. So you just select that. You select the file type required. I'll go through the screens in a minute. And then you download the data. It automatically gives you the last 2 years of data. And that's very useful for this project because given that COVID's occurred within the last 2 years, I want to look at the COVID and non-COVID data to see what gives us a representative year of data. So registering with My Home Energy, this is what you'd see online. And down the bottom left-hand side of that screen, if you haven't yet registered, you'll need to do it first, and it says register now for My Home Energy. It also says you can download your data from My Home Energy as well, but if you're not registered, it'll realise that, so that when you hit My Home Energy, it'll take you to the registration page. And a couple of important things if you haven't registered, I know some people have had some problem with this, it asks for your first name and your last name, and you think, well, that's pretty straightforward, but there's a trick involved. It has to be the first name and the last name that you have on your energy retailer bill. So it has to match the name that is on the bill that comes to you each month or each quarter, whichever it is. Just make sure you use the correct name there. The NMI, the National Meter Identifier, is also on your bill, as is your meter number. So all the top 2 lines there will come directly from a bill that you've already received. And then you just give an email, phone number, and a password. And of course, you've got to say you're not a robot. If you are registered or after you've just registered, you can then go to log in. So you'll just use your email and the password you supplied at registration. Again, confirm you're not a robot. Once you're not a robot and you get in, you'll see something like this. This is just showing you the weekly usage of your property. You can look at other things, daily, monthly, etc., etc. But what we're coming in for is to export the data for a later usage. So there is up at the top of the screen a thing saying export data, which I've circled. So you just click on that. It'll take you to another screen, which will then show you your account or your NMIs. And if you've got more than one, you'll have more than one line there, but you probably only have one. And what we then want you to do is to click on that export data button again, the one that's down on towards the bottom right. Click on the little arrow next to it, and that will give you 2 options for different ways of exporting the data. Both of them will be what are called CSV files, and that's a comma-separated values. So it's a very simple file format that's widely used, but they have two different reports. And so what you should ask for is the summary report, because then all the files will be in the same format and easier to operate with. Once you click on summary report, your data will be exported. The 2 years of your half-hourly readings for your imports and exports will come into a file, and very soon thereafter, because it's only a fairly small file, you'll find a file with a long convoluted name with lots of numbers and then saying something like AusNet Services VEC format. That'll be in your downloads folder. Once you download it, bring it across to your desktop or some folder you're working in. If you open the file in Excel, and Excel will automatically open CSV files, you'll see something like this. This is just my own file that I downloaded last week. I've just blanked out the NMI for privacy reasons, etc. And I should just make the point that if you do provide data for this project, all of the identifying information will be taken off. You'll be given a serial number. Okay, so the first column in column C is just telling you what type of reading it is. In my case, I've got two types. I don't have solar panels at the moment. So it shows consumption, which is just on your normal meter reading, and controlled load consumption is the other one you'll often find there. And that's for things like your hot water heating, which is on a separate circuit and which is charged differently to your normal consumption. So what I've got there is for each day, you've got two readings. For every half hour from midnight to 30 minutes after, it shows how much I used on each of those circuits. And that will go on for 48 time intervals, the 24 hours of the day cut into half-hourly periods. So it's a file which is about 50 columns wide, and for 2 years of data, in my case, was about 1,400 rows deep, which seems like a lot of data, but it's a very simple format and it's not a very big file at all. So getting that then enables the next stage of the process to go ahead. And what I'm going to show now is an example of what we call the data matching. What PowerTracer does is to match records from different participants. So for, let's just say 2 participants, they'll look at how much energy did participant A buy from the grid in that half hour, how much did they sell to the grid in that half hour. Similarly, for participant B, how much did they buy, how much did they sell. If participant A, like me, I don't sell anything because I don't have solar panels, because our house is in a very shaded area, in that situation, I've just got purchases from the grid. So I'm purchasing power in every half-hour period. If participant B was actually with solar panels and selling to the grid as well, then if I wanted to buy in a half-hour period and they're willing to sell in a half-hour period, that's a data match. So if I want to buy 10 units, they want to sell 20 units, then I buy 10 units off them, and they've got 10 units left to either sell to the grid or sell to someone else. If I want to buy 20 units and they're only selling 10 units, then I would buy all their 10 units. I still want to buy 10 more units, and if there's anyone else who's selling, I could buy off them as well. So that data matching goes on. And the little example I want to go through now is using actual NMI data from myself and Pete McKernan. I've done it just for one day, just to keep it simple and keep it obvious what's going on. It was on a cold but sunny day in May 2021. As I say, I have no solar, but Pete has solar and batteries. So we're a sort of perfect match for matching, and it raises an important point. Microgrids need non-solar households. There is absolutely no point having a microgrid all with solar panels, because during the middle of the day, they'll all be collecting lots of solar energy, they'll all want to sell it, and they'll have no one who wants to buy it. So they'll have to sell it to the grid. That mixture of solar and non-solar households is very important. These were my NMI data for that day. The orange on the left is our controlled load. That's the hot water heating that takes place between about midnight and, in our case, about 6 in the morning. I've realised it's not a very efficient hot water heater, even though it's a heat exchanger, to run for 6 hours. During that nighttime period, we buy very little from the grid for other purposes. But come 9:30, it was a very cold day. Rita was not yet in Switzerland. Rita likes warm rooms. So while she was working in the office, as many of you are aware, from 9:30 in the morning till midnight, she had the heater on. So there was a lot of energy being bought on that day. Pete's is a very different package. Because Pete has solar panels, he has entries both above and below the line here. The simplest to look at is the blue columns going down during the middle of the day, and that's his solar sales. It's not his solar generation. He generated more power than this, but this is what he had left over to sell to the grid after his own consumption. Okay, you can see how it peaks during the middle of the day, goes from about 9 o'clock till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, with a peak at around midday. On the left-hand side of the screen, the orange again is the controlled load, so that's his hot water heating, which is more efficient apparently and gets it done in about an hour, not 6. And the grey is energy that Pete was buying from the grid between midnight and 6 in the morning at off-peak rates to recharge his batteries, partially recharge his batteries, so that he could make toast and coffee when he woke up that morning. Didn't want to fully recharge the batteries because then you'd waste the sun that's going to shine the following day. But Pete uses the batteries during the night to keep him going, and in this case, because the batteries had gone down a bit already, he needed to recharge it. So you see all that when you look at the NMI data. Now, the interesting part from our point of view is the matching. You can see that I wanted to buy energy, a lot of it, between 9:30 and midnight. Pete had energy that he was already selling to the grid between 9:30 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So when we put those two together, it's clear that Pete can make sales to me during that period. So when we do that matching, we get something like this, and I'll just take a minute to explain what each of these are. The green areas, the above, the dark green, is what I buy from Pete in each half-hour period. Has to be matched in that half-hour period, remember. And the light green area is just the reverse of that. It's what Pete sells to me. So during the middle of the day, and this is just the daytime hours, by the way, because in the early morning and the late evening, there was no trading going on at all because Pete wasn't generating any solar energy during that period. So during the day, I buy a lot from Pete, but in the early part of the morning, from 9 to 11, Pete wasn't yet generating enough excess solar energy to cover our heating energies. So we still had to buy power from the grid. And similarly, during the late afternoon, when Pete was not producing much solar, we again had to start buying from the grid. But during the middle of the day, our needs for heating were well met by what Pete had left over from his solar. In fact, for about 2.5 hours there, the light red, the pink colour under the axis, Pete had some still left over to sell to the grid. Now, if there'd been another participant who was being matched, they may well have absorbed that solar energy from Pete as well. So the more you've got in the scheme, the more likely it is that you'll find matches between buyers and sellers. As I say, when you've got a large number of people in the scheme, there's lots of possibilities for how you do that matching. And PowerTracer actually uses multiple levels of matching in a sort of hierarchical fashion as to where they match buyers and sellers. So firstly, they'll match you with, if the retailer has got any renewable sources themselves. A lot of retailers are now having arranged to construct their own solar farms. So they sell their own energy as well as from the grid. And sometimes they use that to get a guaranteed market in this way by matching people with their solar farm. So everyone has got a large supply of solar that they can buy from to start with. The participants can then have nominated friends who they specify. So you might have 3 or 4 households, friends, who you'd preferentially like to buy and sell with. For example, if I'm a non-solar household, I would pick someone who's got solar panels as a friend because they're more likely to be able to satisfy my needs, not having solar panels myself. Or it could be that you want to actually donate energy to a local school or a local hospital or something of that nature. It could be a philanthropic thing on your own behalf that you want to match your excess solar, and instead of selling it to the grid, you donate it to some recipient. And you'll nominate those friends, friend 1, 2, 3, etc., and then you'll be matched with the person 1, then the person 2, then the person 3. And once you run out of friends, then you'll be matched with anyone else in the program that's a participant in the power tracer system with that retailer. You may or may not know those other participants, but if they've got solar to sell and you want to buy, or if you've got solar to sell and they want to buy, then you can be matched with them. And that's where the intricacy comes in the power matching, of looking at all these different potential matches so that you can then do it. If at the end of the day, you've got more power generated than you can sell to all the other participants in the power tracer system and for that retailer, then it's sold to the grid as per normal. And if there's a shortage and there's not enough power to buy from your power tracer colleagues, then you'll buy it from the grid. So you go through those different levels. Another rule that power tracer needs is how to deal with shortages. If you've got more energy to sell than to buy, then it's pretty simple. Everyone is satisfied because you're generating more energy than everyone wants to use, and you'll just sell the rest of the grid in the end. But if you've got insufficient renewables for sale, you can't satisfy everyone's demands, then they'll be allocated in various ways to the other participants after your friends have been satisfied. So when you're dealing with your non-friends, then there have to be some rules as to how do you allocate scarce resources, that is renewable energy, when there's a higher demand for those in that half-hour period. Remember, we're always talking about those half-hour periods. One system they use is first in, first served. Whoever joins the power tracer scheme first with that retailer gets to be the top of the list. And they use that often when they're starting up a scheme to get people to join early. But it's a bit restrictive because once that's set in place, it's set in place and there's no incentive for anyone else to join once the first in, first served have been satisfied. The second thing is they allocate equal amounts for all buyers. Let's say you've got 1,000 units of solar energy and there's, let's say, 200 buyers and they each want 10 units of solar energy. So there's demand for 2,000 units, 200 by 10, and you've only got 1,000 units. So you can't satisfy the entire demand. So what they do is give an equal amount. They split the 1,000 amongst the 200, give everyone 5, and that would consume all 1,000. However, some of those people wanting to buy may only want to buy 2 or 3, less than 5, what they've already been allocated. So there's some surplus left over. And so what they do is go a second round of these allocations, allocate it evenly, see who's satisfied, take their surplus, allocate the surplus among those who are still in and want some, and then do it a third time if necessary, and so on. A third alternative is to have equal proportions, not equal amounts, equal proportions of demand satisfied for everyone. So in that case, if you had 1,000 units to sell and there's a demand for 2,000, everyone would get a half of what they wanted. It'd be different amounts, but the same proportion. Everyone would get 50%, 1,000 over 2,000. So there's lots of different ways in which you could do that, and there's more and more ways depending what your objectives are. So how does Power Tracer do that? Well, what it does, unlike my example where I just had 2 participants, they look at all possible trades of all the people who are participating in Power Tracer with that retailer. According to the rules we just had, the rules for allocation, for shortages and so on, and they look at all the possible trades that could have happened in yesterday's NMI data. that the power itself has already been consumed, generated and consumed yesterday. But there's this ongoing trace of how much was produced and consumed, or how much was offered for sale and how much was bought, which can now be allocated between the buyers and the sellers, just like a PPA. When the councils go into a deal with a big solar farm on a power purchase agreement, that's done the same way as this, and they allocate it in very similar ways in retrospective fashion. Having done the allocation, found the matches for day one, they then keep a running tally of those buys and sells for each participant. Next day they go on and they do it for day two, and then day three, and they just keep a tally of that throughout the period. And then they provide a monthly summary to the retailer for each participant, and that's then included in their monthly electricity bill. It shows how much was bought and sold with the microgrid, the power tracer participants, and then how much was bought and sold with the grid. So it's just another dimension to your normal power bill, which just shows how much you buy and sell with the grid. Now it's showing, firstly, how much did you do with the microgrid participants, and then what was left over to sell and buy with the grid. So what are the benefits of a microgrid? Well, firstly, it's just the satisfaction of knowing where your electricity comes from and where it goes to. How much of the energy you consume is actually renewable from local sources, and how much of your excess goes to a local beneficiary. I know a lot of people, when they sell their solar power to the grid, they do with a heavy heart, because they think, I'm just giving this back to the distributor at virtually no cost for them to make a profit on. You know, I sell it for 10, they sell it back to someone else for 30. And that's a common feeling. If you can actually see where your energy that you export to the grid goes to, and you know it's your next door neighbour or school down the road, then it's got some degree of just mental satisfaction. But it also gives you the ability to buy and sell at slightly better prices than you either sell to the grid at the moment or buy from the grid. Now, at the moment, there's not a great deal of scope for that, but there are steps underway which may give greater scope in the future. Things like changes in the network charges. How much does AusNet charge to distribute your energy from producer to consumer? At the moment, most of it is on a kilowatt hour basis. It's so many cents per kilowatt hour. So the more they take from you or give to you, the more you pay them. But there's good logical reason to have distance-based charges. Just as with, say, a toll road, the further you travel on the toll road, the more you pay, or a public transport system like the Melbourne 3-zone system, the further you travel, the more you pay. The same sort of thing happens with electricity. The longer you've got to transfer and transmit that energy, the more it's costing, because you need a much bigger network. If you're only sending it to your neighbour next door, you're using only a small fraction of that network. And so there's a good case for distance-based charges, so that it's not just how much you send, but how far you send it. And one other benefit of microgrid is what's called frequency control ancillary services. I'll try not to confuse you with this one. It's known as FCAS. The electricity network, because it's alternating current, what alternating current means is that the direction of flow alternates backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards. And it does so at a certain frequency, 50 hertz, 50 times per second. If in the network you have an imbalance of electricity demand and supply, that will change the frequency, the hertz. So if you've got more demand than supply, it'll go one way, and if you've got more supply than demand, it'll go the other way. If in fact the supply is greater than demand, that is, and this is the problem a lot of people are talking about at the moment, all these solar panels during the middle of the day are putting a lot of energy into the network when the demand is not very high. So the supply is much greater than the demand. Then what FCAS, the Frequency Control Ancillary Services, tries to do is to pay people or organisations for reducing supply or increasing demand to lower the hertz. When you've got more supply than demand, it tends to increase the frequency. So what you want to do is get that back to about 50. And the way to do that is if you can reduce the supply, get people to stop generating, stop feeding into the system, or increase demand, turn things on to use some of that power now, then that will bring the frequency down. On the other hand, if demand is greater than supply, then FCAS pays for increasing supply, start generating more power to meet the demand, or reduce demand. Stop using energy now to bring it back to the available supply. When I was with Power Shop, we used to be paid on various occasions to stop using electricity. And they would send out an email the day beforehand saying, tomorrow between 2 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon, we're going to pay you for not using electricity, which sounded very strange at the time. Normally they'd charge you for using electricity, but they were deliberately trying to tell us to stop using electricity and they'd pay us for that. And the reason was that in that situation, and it was usually on very hot summer days, the demand for air conditioners was outstripping the supply. So Power Shop was being paid FCAS benefits to reduce demand. Hence, they could afford to transfer that on to the consumers to say, well, if you stop using the power between these hours, we'll pay you. Clearly, Power Shop was getting paid more than they were paying us, but that's okay. So that's basically what FCAS is about. That's very general terms. Now, most of these FCAS services are supplied by larger installations, the retailers, or for example, Portland Aluminium Smelter, a huge consumer of power, but they have FCAS arrangements so that when necessary, they will turn off some of their facilities and stop using, and then they'll turn them back on when they need to start changing the frequency in a different direction. So whilst it does go with most of the larger installations, there's some scope for battery-equipped smaller systems. However, one of the things I've learned in all of this is what's true one week may not be true the next week. Just during the last week, I was reading an article where, I forget which one of the government organisations or one of the regulators is changing the system for FCAS payments so that it disadvantages the smaller systems. Okay, well, so getting on to the last steps. What can be done before October, before Council makes up the decision? Firstly, recruiting potential participants. And I say potential participants because no one is locked in at this stage. We're just trying to get a head start. First thing to do with those participants is to do a small survey of their situation so that we can better understand and better model what's happening. For example, the demographics of their household. We know that larger households use more electricity. We know households in different situations, like working couples, use electricity in their home at different times than retired couples. Families with kids are different to families without kids, etc., etc. So all those demographics make quite a difference to how they consume energy. Secondly, we need to find out about what have they got in terms of generation capabilities. Do they have solar panels? If so, how many? What orientation are they on? Do they have batteries? If so, what size, etc., etc. So that sort of information so we can get an idea of how much is likely to be used on site, how much is likely to be put up for sale. We would also ask the participants for 2 years of their NMI data so that we get some real data from different households across the spectrum and match it up with the characteristics we've just talked about in terms of their situation. Getting 2 years of data enables me to analyse that data to try to find a normal year. That is something that might be around post-COVID. I have no idea what a normal year is anymore. I have really no idea what post-COVID electricity usage might look like. All I know is that from my own situation, my energy consumption during COVID was much greater than what it was in a non-COVID period. Analysing those 2 years, which has got effectively 12 months of full COVID, let's call it that, and 12 months of not so full COVID, will give us an idea of what a normal year might look like in the future. What I would then do is to model electricity consumption and production of the participants using EPAC model, the electricity production and consumption model, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then I'd compare the results of that modelling with the data that you've provided in your NMI data. What I'm trying to do is to model that information so that it replicates the NMI data, and then by calibrating or refining the model to get a better agreement with the NMI data, we're in a good position to move forward with that model to do some other analysis. Let me just talk about what that EPAC model looks like. What it's trying to do is measure the interchanges between households and the grid. Now, if you have a solar household at the current time, what that household, it may or may not have a battery, but if it's got solar panels, it's capturing that solar energy. And how much it captures will be a function of weather and how many panels and orientation of the panels and so on. It's then using some of that energy itself, and the more it can use of what it captures, the better, because that's where the real economic benefits come from. If it doesn't have enough solar energy captured, it will buy from the grid. But if it has more than enough, it will sell to the grid. And that's your standard operation of a simple, isolated solar household. What the microgrid does is to add another dimension to that, so that instead of just selling back to the grid, that solar household can now sell to the microgrid or through the microgrid, sell it on to either a non-solar household or a solar household with fewer panels, or a solar household with higher consumption. Whoever needs the power, you've now got the opportunity to sell through the microgrid to those other households. And if you've still got some left over, then you can sell it to the grid. From the point of view of the non-solar household, previously their only other option was to buy from the grid. That's all they could do. What they can now do is to buy through the microgrid from a solar household within the system. So it's opening up options in different ways. And the financial advantage to both households will be the difference between what they could buy from the grid for compared to what they can buy through the microgrid, and or what they could sell to the microgrid for compared to what they could sell to the grid. So that's the sort of system that this EPAC model is trying to model. And it does it through a number of steps. Firstly, it models energy consumption of each of the participants. And this will be a function of demographics, weather, all the sort of things that influence how much energy you use in a particular half-hour period. We're trying to get it to that level of detail because we need to match it with the NMI data. Secondly, any energy production. This is a function of things like how much solar irradiation, how much solar energy is coming from the sun that day, which will be a function of the weather and the cloudiness and a few other things. How many panels you've got and their orientation and a few other issues. So just how much energy is being produced by households in a half-hourly basis. You then compare the two to work out whether there's an excess or a deficit of solar energy for that household in that 30 minutes. If they've got an excess of solar energy, they may be able to put it into a battery if they have one, if the battery's not full. Or if there's a deficit and they have a battery, they can take energy out of their battery rather than buy from the grid. So that would also be modelled. And after that stage of the consumption, production, excess and storage, then how much do you have available to sell to the microgrid, or how much do you need to buy from the microgrid? And essentially what we're trying to do here is to model how a power tracer works. And luckily a couple of years ago when we were doing a project for the Taggart microgrid, the modelling I did then effectively mirrors what Power Tracer is doing on a commercial basis now. So with a few little tweaks, we can do that quite easily. And then after all the microgrid sales and purchases have been satisfied, then we sell and buy from the grid as a last resort. So that's what we do with the modelling. And then we can do the data matching. One of the good things about doing the modelling rather than just relying on the data is the data gives you one snapshot of what has happened. What the modelling does is to give you lots of different snapshots with what might happen. For example, we can look at the weather for last year and you could just use what the actual weather was, or there are models of weather which will give you lots and lots of predictions what weather could be next year and the year after and the year after. Each of those following years won't be the same as last year, but they'll exhibit similar trends. So the fact that you're getting different inputs, you can experiment with different scenarios to get different outputs and get a range of outputs. You can also deliberately change some of the variables. For example, how is power priced? What if it was priced in a different way? How does a network charge for distributing the energy? What if it was done in a different way? Just to give you an example of why that's important. We look at pricing and charging. This is just a breakdown of retail power prices in Victoria this year. You can see that from the total of the average of 24.6 down the bottom cents per kilowatt hour, that's across all times of day of the year, wholesale energy prices, the buying of energy itself, either from the big generators, your lawn, or from solar panels via feed-in tariffs and so on, the wholesale price is 10.1 cents per kilowatt hour. That's how much it costs for the energy itself. Then you've got to transmit it from remote sources to where the consumption is, and that's the transmission cost of 1.4 cents per kilowatt. Then you've got to distribute it to all the users, 9.1. The smart metering does not come free, and so they recoup that by a charge on kilowatt hours. One could argue whether it's usage-based or not, it's really a fixed cost. And then there are environmental charges, particularly on dirty energy, coal-based energy, to make up for the environmental impacts of that energy. And that's included in all power prices. Now, that's one type of charge you see on your bill, but the other one you see, what are called standing charges. Victorian average I gave for the usage charges on the left from a report showing Victorian averages. They didn't have a breakdown of the standing charges, so I've just used the breakdown from Energy Locals, who we would most likely be working with on the microgrid project. They have a daily charge of 57 cents per day. You may be paying a lot more than that on your own bills at the moment. You may well be paying around $1.10, $1.15 per day before you use anything. And the reason why theirs is low is that they have deliberately put their retailer revenue as part of a standing charge rather than something that is per kilowatt hour. Lots of companies have a retailer cost in cents per kilowatt hour. And the more you use, the more you pay the retailer. But again, really the retailer should be a fixed cost. It doesn't matter how much energy they're buying and selling, they just got to exist. So what Energy Locals and a number of others are doing now is having a retailer cost as a standing charge, and they charge 28 cents per day. That's for online service only. If you're quite happy with Energy Locals to just have an online portal and not want to ring them up and ask questions, which means they have to have a call centre, then you pay 28 cents a day. If you want the ability to get help over the phone, you pay an extra 31 cents per day. Most of the people, from what I can gather, are going with the purely online system, so they're paying 85 cents per day, the 28 and the 57. The reason I put this up is to show where the changes could occur. For example, if you've got a microgrid system where you're producing and buying all the energy locally, and in fact, most of the energy you produce could be consumed by people in your own street, and most of what you buy could come from people in your own street, then you certainly don't need transmission, the high voltage power lines. So there's scope for the transmission figure to largely be eliminated in that situation. Distribution, if you're only using a very small part of the network to distribute it, why should you pay the same as someone who's bringing it in from Queensland? So the distribution cost could well go down. Metering will probably stay there. You could argue with the environmental costs. We're buying and consuming, producing and consuming all renewable energy. Why do we pay any environmental charge at all? Because we've already met that objective of 100% renewables, which is why the environmental charges exist. So there's a lot of potential there why there could be changes in how much we pay for energy, either by usage or standing charges. And so the final thing, after we do all those experiments, show what might happen, how we could change things, then in October, they'll be presenting the results to participants as a forward to what could be done after October, particularly if we get the council funding for the project. At that stage, we would need, individually and as a group, to make a decision. We would need to go with a single retailer who supports the power tracer system. And the one that is available locally, Energy Locals, already uses power tracer. So that would be my recommendation. However, one of the things in that first 3 months until October is looking at what the impact might be on each one individually of switching retailer. What's your existing deal for energy? What might it be with and without a microgrid with a different retailer? So we'd be looking at those issues. But to be part of the microgrid down the track, we'd all need to be with the same retailer. We'd then establish the power tracer system with the retailer, and we'd seek some design issues to be refined there. We'd continue doing the modelling of the households with next year's weather, and also using the actual NMI data as well. And then if we are actually running a power tracer system with a retailer, we will get on our monthly bills how much we buy and sell through the microgrid and how much we buy and sell with the grid. And that can then be compared with the results of the modelling. And again, the advantage of doing the modelling is you can then say, well, what if something did change? How would that lead us in the following year? And then the final stage would be to summarise what benefits were obtained and what might be obtainable with some changes in how the system operates.